Welcome to Coaches on Zoom Getting Coffee. Each episode features a candid, unfiltered, and unedited conversation between two coaches. Hosted by Daniel Kimball, CEO of Resonance Executive Coaching.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm really happy to have Dennis. He also goes by DJ Johnson, a friend and colleague of mine. If you want to introduce yourself briefly, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks for having us or having me. And my name is Dennis Johnson. I run a couple different organizations, one being Leadership, Architecture, and Design. And I think that's how I know you, Daniel.
Yeah. So tell me, what's top of mind? What's top of heart for you right now?
What's top of mind and what's top of heart? That's a great question. I think what's top of mind is just, I live here in Chicago, Illinois. There's some things relaxing as it relates to social distancing that are going into effect actually today on May 1st. I just think, the world's so different today than it was even just a month or so ago. But I think that's on top of mind, just about how things start to reopen and what that looks like from a business standpoint and from leaders' mindset. What's top of heart? Probably related to that, just, thinking about my clients, our work, how we help people transition and move through this very interesting time that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, as you alluded to, and this stuff is starting to reopen. At least we're seeing more of a path to reopening just in the last, week or so in the U.S. I think it's, shifted a lot in terms of the focus and knowledge of what's likely coming, and a lot of trepidation, I would say, or at least concern or lack of clarity around like when exactly is each state going to open, and what is it going to look like, and is it too early? That kind of stuff. Top of mind for me for sure. Like what's it going to look like, and are we doing it maybe a little too quickly? What's your take on that? Everybody has kind of their own, take on it, but what are you saying? What are you thinking? And I know from my perspective, I'm concerned that we might be moving too quickly, but I'm also really anxious to get out there and get stuff going again. So it's like a balancing act, and I don't have the clear answer on that. To me, it's like, well, we'll find out in a couple of weeks when we see more data about what happens, basically. But what's your take on it?
Yeah, I would agree. It feels like, we don't really know what to do, right? The waiting is hard, and it's hard on the economy, but we know it's good for the health, and I think from a public health standpoint, but I also think people are feeling anxious. I think that's a common theme that I see showing up in myself at times, and certainly my clients and their work. And I think, as Westerners, we're not used to being told we can't have freedoms that we're used to. And I think
Right.
For most people, that's a very uncomfortable state. And so I think there's some like consciousness to that at a society kind of community level about, what does that mean for us, and how am I moving through that process? But also, how does it change us and transform us in ways as we kind of move forward? So back to your question about just, my thoughts, I think, it depends on the industry too. I think industries that rely on public participation at some level, whether that's consumers or, event goers or whatnot, I think, their worlds have been severely disrupted, and their business models are probably certainly stretched and really strained right now. So I think that's a big concern. I also think, if we reopen, and then are people really going to want to go places?
Yeah.
I think that's the other challenge is like business and I think economics, they want to reopen because it's so hard to not have, money moving throughout the community and our city and whatnot. But I think it's also about, well, we reopen. What's the cost of reopening if you don't get people to come? So there's kind of this metaphor of like, if you build it, will they come? And
Right. And right now, it's not very clear what's going to happen there. I think there's likely to be some trepidation from people about once stuff does open up, when do we actually start going to restaurants again or going to more social gatherings in whatever form it takes? And that to me is an open question for sure. I don't know, as a business owner, various businesses are impacted very differently by this, right? We're all feeling the pain to some extent. It just depends on, to what extent. And those that, as you said, that are more dependent on the face-to-face interactions are more feeling it more. But to me, I want to see where we go from here, and just not very much clarity. But I'm excited to see stuff starting to happen.
Yeah, I keep referring to it as the now normal. It's like, I think
Right.
people used to use the new normal, and it's like, well, things are just so fluid that I don't even know that we can say they're new, because like they're changing so rapidly. And it's just who's been through a pandemic before? I mean, most
Right.
of us have never. So even if you're not touched by the disease, I think the upheaval that's caused by the virus, is having profound impacts on people's livelihood and on just kind of life circumstances at a broader ecosystem. So I mean, when's the last time that industries have like completely shut down and consumer demand kind of dropped overnight almost? I mean,
Right.
maybe
That's
in
never
war
happened.
prior to
Right.
that, probably never.
Right.
So I think, from our leadership work and our organizational work for businesses, the priority is initially how do they keep their employees and their customers kind of safe so that they can start to bring people back and start to reopen. But I also think, there's also just catastrophic kind of challenges with cash flow and supply and operational issues as we start to try and reopen.
Right. For sure.
But
Go ahead.
I just think, it's also opportunity. It gives, I don't know, I was reading something recently, I don't know where it was from, but, it's like something's trying to happen, and so if we can take and embrace that kind of logic or that theory and go, okay, well, what's the universe trying to tell us? There's a bit of a reset that I think is an opportunity for individuals, whether it's in their personal lives or also I think organizational leaders, and just what have they been doing? What do they want to be doing? How can they do it differently? Because we kind of have an opportunity to do a reset.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts about that? Because I definitely see a lot of opportunity, a lot of things changing, a lot of chances for things to change in major ways coming out of this. What's your guess as to what might happen? What are you kind of hoping for as far as change from here goes?
Yeah, I think, we do work in the social, we do quite a bit of work in the social sector. So when I say that, I mean like traditionally kind of human services fields. And so I look at it from kind of the broader social sector view, and then also kind of the economic, I think, challenges that those bring. And so I think it's an opportunity to really kind of reorder what communities' priorities are and really fundamentally try and reshape kind of like how our societies work. I had a conversation with a leader yesterday. Their business is deemed necessary, but they have had their employee base working from home for the last 6 weeks roughly, and they're going to start bringing employees back into the office. I think in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from Monday, so the 18th. And he was just basically talking to me and saying, is it safe? They're going to have PPE for us, but are we going to be able to really maintain a social distance from people in an office environment? And what if someone gets sick? And like, what's the liability? And are they going to take care of if the fact that it has an economic impact on my personal life at home? And
Right.
all these questions, right, that we would have never really thought of before. So I think it is an opportunity for owners, leaders to really reorient themselves to kind of this now normal and make choices about really what's needed and what's possible as we kind of move forward. So I don't think it's simple, but I do think there's some kind of an iterative process that's going to happen here.
Yeah, and some of the offline conversations I've had with you have been around that, like the desire to cultivate and become more agile, whether it's on a personal level, a business level, leadership teams, et cetera. What's your take on that? I think this is a great opportunity to really get better at that. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, in the work that we do and that you do, Daniel, as well, you've oftentimes talked about VUCA, right? And that,
Right.
things are so volatile and uncertain. And, I think this is like VUCA squared right now, right?
At
So
least, right.
I think, people have long thought about, well, agility sounds good, it's necessary, we have to be nimble. But I think at the core of it, most people don't like change. And so I think it's difficult for individuals to embrace that kind of thinking, much less then try and kind of build it into the culture of an organization. So I do think that it's all upside opportunity, but I do think organizations are going to struggle to really try and be more agile, because I don't think that's necessarily a new concept, but I just think that most organizations, they have a hard time embracing change because of the human element.
Right.
And I think that will be pervasive now because of the kind of safety and the overall well-being that people are concerned about.
Right. There's this conflict right now, I think, between that concern, rightfully so, about our well-being, our safety in so many ways, and how when that feels like it's threatened, which for many of us it is right now, it's even harder to change, right? And so on the one hand, I see like more desire, more urgency to become more agile, but at the same time, I can see why we, in many ways, might become more stuck right now because of the fear, because of the concern about what's going to happen to our livelihoods, et cetera, and our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's where, the work that we do at Leaders and that you do, this, but, it's like, how do we help people kind of see through the forest right now? Because I think people are getting stuck and they're anxious. I think you may have talked about on one of your previous podcasts about, the Harvard Business Review and just what's the feeling people are experiencing? And it's grief, right? Like something was taken from us quickly.
Yeah.
And most people don't really understand the emotion of grief very well. And so they might not be sleeping well, they might not be eating well, they might not be getting the physical activity that they're used to. I think, we're all kind of living with people more closely than we normally are because we don't leave.
Right.
So I think emotions are strained and relationships are challenged. And so, I think, and I also worry when things start to reopen, are we kind of like popping the cork on something where it's like people have been like kept up for so long that now they want to get out, and are they going to be a little out of control at some level? And then does it like create this cycle of like repeating itself? So
right. There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I have concerns about we might go too far. We've been cooped up for what feels like a long time. When we get a chance to go out, we might go a little too far. On the flip side of that, I sense that people are still going to be relatively cautious for some time too. So I'm encouraged by that. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But what are you doing? I know for me and people I speak with, we're all feeling some level of, more emotions going on, more things happening in our lives, more points to be concerned about. Like, what are you doing for yourself personally to kind of keep that, to process what's going on, not deny it or push it away, but also, what do you do with it and how do you process it and how do you keep productive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to mindfulness and consciousness. I think, you know me, I think it always comes back to that, and just how do we take care of ourselves from kind of the whole body perspective. So what am I using to fuel myself? What am I eating, right? What's my nutrition look like? I hear people referencing on social media about how we're all gaining 19 pounds from the COVID-19, and so I'm not having that experience. I'm probably eating less. So I think I'm trying to make healthier food choices. So I think that's one part of it. I think exercise is hard. I have a dog, so I have the flexibility and the nuance of needing to like leave my home to walk the dog, a couple times a day. So I'm getting some physical activity. Riding my bike. I rode my bike a few times. I'll probably ride this weekend. The weather's turning here finally again. So I think it's, what kind of balance do you have? And I think if people have relatively good balance in their lives prior to this, they're probably trying to maintain some semblance to that. But I think a lot of leaders are not very well balanced, at least the ones that we tend to work with. It's like they are stretched and stressed and oftentimes numbing. And so they're probably not sleeping well. They're not eating well. They may not be getting physical activity. And I do think mindfulness is a large part of this as well, in building a practice around just trying to, calm yourself down when you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed.
And how do you, what would you recommend to people who maybe don't have a mindfulness practice yet? How do they get started? How do they help themselves right now? Because as you said, I think a lot of leaders would like to be better at this, right? They'd like to be more mindful, and we have so many challenges on our plate right now. It can actually be even harder in some ways to start any new habits. But what are your suggestions or thoughts about that? How to get started or go deeper with what you're already doing?
Yeah, I would say, well, that was me not that long ago, right? Like I probably was one of those leaders and one of those executives in a former life where, you're overcompensating in some areas because you're not well balanced. And so, I think it's about starting small, and it's like anything else, trying to build a habit around something. And so, I think there's tools out there to help do that. There's apps, there's Mindspace, there's, one that I'm using right now, but there's several different apps out there that, I think help people learn about what it means to actually sit with yourself. And so, I think it's trying to experiment and have some micro kind of opportunities to try to calm your mind in some ways. I think it's also about just trying to interrupt the narrative that we often have, that inner kind of talk that we all humans have,
Right.
that inner voice that's running through our minds all the time. And so can we catch ourselves? I think that's part of it as well. But, I think from a mindfulness perspective, it's just about actually learning to just get in touch with your body, and that doesn't necessarily mean I have to sit in lotus position on a bolster. I think it's about having a somatic experience as well.
Right. What are you doing for fun these days? What's keeping you busy in a fun perspective?
Well, work is fun for me. I'm single, so I tend to probably dive into work when I'm bored or have extra time on my hands. So we're building a back end, a learning management system for our website so that we can deliver more work online and more work asynchronously, so that there's more kind of learning on demand for our clients and our prospective clients. And so I've been spending a lot of free time just building that and trying to get content out there and flipping our kind of traditional classroom from face to face to something that would be more of a virtual delivery. I do think that's not just that learning piece, but I do think having everyone work from home is going to drive demand for, we have different ways to learn, different ways to work. How do we do it effectively and productively? And I think people are getting a taste of something that a lot of organizations have historically resisted. And I think that's another kind of challenge that's going to come in the workplace as we start to kind of move into this new phase, whatever it is next, around, people are going to want more flexibility. They're going to want more work-life balance. Companies are going to need to be more receptive to having some work from home arrangements on some type of pattern or schedule, because people, I think, are going to realize the benefits to this as well.
I do think people's expectations of the workplace are going to permanently shift in a number of ways. Some of it's going to be about working from home more often. Some of it's going to be about better work-life balance. And I think the way that we consume learning, as you were saying too, that's definitely going to shift. People's expectations are shifting. You said something interesting there that I'd love to unpack a little bit more, because I don't know that everybody has this experience, but I myself am in a work that I love. And it's like, sometimes it can be hard to have a boundary around that. But I'm not even sure I want a boundary because I love it so much. But what's your path? How did you get to that place in life where you're doing work that you love?
Well, I market myself as a recovering banker. So I spent 2 decades as a financial services executive. And how did I come to this work? Through graduate school, I got an executive coach, and they did some values work with me. That was one of the first things that we talked about, is like, what do you really value? Do some values mining and try and get clear around what it is that drives me. And so I think, that's, and this from being a coach as well, that's such pivotal work to figure out, like, well, what do people really want and what do they value in life, and how do you move closer to that? So for me, it was, was doing well financially at the time, and really didn't enjoy the work that much, right? It was like it was a job. It wasn't like fulfilling to me. And so I had a coach, and they helped me kind of just realize this work is not aligned with my personal values. So I sector flipped. This is about 10 years ago now, and then went to go work for a community development financial institution, which was really rooted in mission-based work. I mean, I think when you work for a for-profit entity or a large organization, the mission's on the wall in the break room with the espoused values and the vision, and you're like, oh, it looks pretty. But how does that actually come to life day to day? And I think, when you go work in the social sector and you see, okay, people are hungry, people need housing, people need transportation, they're trying to build education. It's like, these are real, life challenges. And so mission work is just so different, I think, in that sector. So I built a consulting organization that was part of a lending organization, and basically did that for 5 years before kind of going off on my own. So, I think everyone's on a different journey and a different path. I would say, I think younger people are figuring it out sooner, which I think that's, I think a positive kind of optimistic view. But I think people that are, maybe our demographic, are still kind of like caught up in the, I have to do what I've always done because that's all I know, and it provides some economic security, and I can't take a risk or a chance. And I think that's just all made up, quite honestly. I think people actually
Yeah,
can do it.
that's the narrative we tell ourselves, but it just holds us back. If the disconnect exists between what we're doing, what we want to do, and our values aren't aligned with what we're doing, then it's just stories to keep us stuck. You have to let go of those stories and create new ones. You touched on a couple of interesting things there. One is that I think younger people, I agree that they, generally speaking, they seem to be more in touch with what they truly want, and maybe a bit more mission driven than I was at that age. And I think part of that goes back to people of younger generations have higher expectations of their work and of their life than we did probably 25, 30 years ago for me. And I think that's a great thing. One of the questions on my mind, because now we're having what's the beginning of probably a longer term economic downturn, will they keep that kind of expectation going? I hope that they do. I hope that they don't let this kind of deter them too much from continuing to have those expectations. What's your take on that? What are you guessing will happen as far as younger people, what it seems to be expectations of more from their life, more from their employers, et cetera, and being more mission based, and faced with perhaps the first major economic downturn that they've experienced?
Yeah. I guess if they're losing their jobs, like, if we're saying worst case scenario, and they don't have a lot of liquidity and financial security, I was talking to somebody yesterday, the day before, and they're like, "Oh, everyone's gonna move home with their parents." It's like
Yeah.
they come back to their family, and I think like my kids are in college right now, and I'm not really planning for them to come back and live with me in school,
Right.
but I also know that there's a lot of that tends to happen too, kind of post college education. But I think younger people, I don't know. I worked with one of my previous business partners is about 15 years younger than me, and like just the value system there between he and I, it's complementary, but it's certainly different. He's very good at turning things off, very good at unplugging, not working after hours, no weekends, just had really good boundaries, I think, around his personal life. And I always appreciated that because it helped me think about my own, and it also helped me probably retool at times as well. So I think of like people in his kind of demographic, and what will change for them. I don't know that they will like adopt maybe a Gen Xer or a baby boomer kind of work style. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think they're gonna be more like, okay, I don't have a job, I'm gonna travel. I'm gonna hike across the country, or I'm gonna ride my bike. I just think that, I don't know, the younger people that I interact with and that I think are in organizations, they just have such a healthier perspective on work-life balance that even if they lose their jobs, I don't see them like kind of flipping and adopting maybe the models that we have held for a long time. What do you think?
I think the expectations maybe will go down some, but like you're saying, I don't see it being fundamentally shifted. I think it's likely to continue to play out the same way it's been playing out, but maybe just maybe not quite expecting quite as much in this environment, but still wanting more from their lives than we. And I think all of us want similar things. I don't think it's that piece is not necessarily different. I think what's really different from my perspective is that different generations have different expectations of their lives and different expectations of their workplace related to their life. And as you're saying, the work life boundary too, I think different expectations around that. And I see that as a great trend, and I think it's likely to continue. Maybe just not quite as much for the next, however long this economic downturn goes on for. But I'm pretty optimistic that will change. It will stay the same more or less, and I think we'll see over time how that plays out.
Yeah, and I think organizations are going to have a competitive advantage there. Those that can either embrace that or accelerate it or adopt it faster. I think, it's going to be a way to think about an organization's brand, and not just the products and services, but like what kind of values do they hold? And so I believe that's the opportunity with this, is that hopefully organizations that survive can also go, maybe we need to retool and really think about how we're, holding our employees whole, and thinking about consumer and really more of kind of the, what I would call kind of a triple bottom line organization, where it's not just about profit, but it's also about the people, and it's also about the, for the better sake of the planet. And so I'm hoping that, there's more certified B Corps come out of this, and that there's just more, I think, organizational consciousness that really drives, I think, better outcomes for us as a humanity.
I think that's a big opportunity in this situation, and I think people's expectations more universally across all generations are probably going to shift to be more in that realm. Is my impression so far. I just wait and see over time what happens, but I think it's going to shift that way. And you touched on this before, and I see this a lot in the organizations that we work with too, where there's always a not I don't want to say a tension, but the values that they aspire to live into versus the actual behaviors day in and day out don't necessarily match as well as they could. And I think people expect more and more of values and words and actions to all match up well. What's your take on that as far as like where are we at, generally speaking today, as far as organizations matching up between aspired values that they're trying to live into versus what they're actually doing? And what do you see as the path forward to be better at that?
Yeah, it's interesting. We use some tools from the Barrett Values Center. So Richard Barrett's work is very in much of a kind of consciousness, mindfulness space. And so his framework is really rooted in these 7 levels of consciousness and leadership. And you can measure them at the organizational level, the team level, the community level, and whatnot. But, I do think many organizations are not aligned with what they espouse versus what is actually going on versus what do the actual people that work there really value.
Right.
And I think sometimes we talk about the gap between what do we espouse and what actually happens, right? What are the behaviors? What are the beliefs that we hold? And I think we fail to look at like, well, what's the collective kind of group from an organization? What do they really value?
Right.
So I think that needs to be looked at it almost in like a three kind of, I guess, columns. You'd say, okay, this is what the workforce inside my organization really values. This is what we say is showing up, and this is what actually shows up. And so
Right.
to me, it's like measuring the entropy between what actually we say we experience versus what we really want. That's, I think, the opportunity to try and close that gap. And, so some organizations talk about conscious capital, and I think the more aligned an organizational values are with what the people's values are that work there, the more successful they're going to be. I mean, I think that's just intuitively, I think, pretty easy to understand. And I think Gallup's been doing research on this for years about just, do you have great managers? Do you espouse your values? Do you live those values? And, and ultimately you get a greater rate of return or an ROI. And so I think it makes sense, but I think a lot of organizations have a hard time figuring out, the values of like the people who work there versus the leaders who run the place.
Right.
I think that's usually what shows up on the wall in the break room. It's like the formal leaders say, this is what we value here. And that's not maybe what we value really on the field and on the line.
And yeah, there can be a tension between what the leadership team, wants to aspire into as far as values, and then what the people who are not on the leadership team want to aspire into, what they actually value and what they want to become. What do you see as the best way to kind of bridge that gap and come to a more uniform culture that satisfies everybody better than it does today?
Well, that's a great question, right? It's the $1 million question. How do you make it happen? How do you close the gap? But, I think it's about, a lot of organizations go on change kind of journeys, and here's the things that we want to change, and here's how we're going to try and change them, and here's the interventions for those change processes. But I think it really what matters and what makes the difference is how you help individuals transform to help accelerate the change. And so for me, it's like it has to happen at the individual level, not just at the group or the business unit or the department kind of levels. It has to be about how do we support individual growth and learning. And so, that's coaching, that's helping people become more aware, that's helping them figure out what they really want, what does a fulfilled life look like. So to me, those are all the kind of ripples of just building a learning culture of sorts. And so how do we help people learn about themselves for the benefit of the organization?
Yeah, culture is nothing more than the collective energy, the collective emotions, the collective mindset, the collective behaviors in an organization. And that starts at the individual level. If the individuals are not transforming to become, better versions of themselves, then the organization or the team is going to struggle too.
Yeah.
I want to circle back to your personal journey. My transformation started about 10 years ago as well, but I want to talk about yours because I know when I think about it today, it kind of feels, I'd say, easier in retrospect than it was when it happened. But when you made that transformation, you sound like you were pretty successful within finance, and then had to recognize at some point they had a disconnect between your own values versus how you were living your life, which I think a lot of us at some point have that kind of awakening. But what were some of the things you struggled with as far as coming to terms with that, maybe getting the awareness in the first place? What did you struggle with along the way to make that change and be where you are today?
What was the struggle? Well, I think it was just the security of a well-paying job, and just the idea that I had young children at the time, so I think there's that kind of you got to take care of your own. I was divorced, and so a lot of people who were dependent on me, and I had responsibilities too from a financial perspective. So I think that was probably the biggest saboteur, is like, I can't take the risk. What if this doesn't work out? Other people depend on me.
Yeah.
I think that was probably a story I held on to for quite a while. And then I think as I started working with my coach at the time and finishing some graduate education, it really was, how do I create a strategy to get out of this, right? If I can't do it overnight and just go, I quit tomorrow, screw this. It's like, okay, well, what's the plan? And so I think, it was about trying to map out a time frame to go, okay, well, what's this look like to try and help me get there so that maybe I could mitigate some of the risk. And serendipitously, I think, you can have a plan, but it never goes exactly to the plan. My plan accelerated, right? It's like things just kind of fell my way, I think, in some ways. And I do think some of it was like setting intention around just, if you set intentions in the world, I think the universe tends to, listen to us at times and bring something back to us. And so to me, it afforded an opportunity to accelerate my time frame so that I didn't actually stay as long as I thought I would.
So it sounds like the struggle was in the realm of letting go of some of those narratives about security, and of course you had financial responsibilities you wanted to honor, and you were concerned in your narrative about how that might play out in a negative way. Like, what if this fails, is one of the things that you said, right? But what else did you struggle with along the way? What would you say to people who maybe want to become or start living more into their values? Like, what's your piece of advice to that, and how did you overcome your struggles along the way?
Yeah, I think there's a narrative that society holds as, men should be providers, right? They need to take care of, and most of them, not most, many of them that I work with in executive roles are not really in touch with themselves, and so I think there's something around vulnerability being seen as a weakness. And so there's a little bit of the risk in there. There's this whole kind of profile of what like the caregiver, the provider should look like. And so I think, those narratives, you have to rewrite them. You have to, find ways to think about and create some strategy around just going, that it doesn't have to be that way. I can rewrite a different chapter or rewrite a different book or a different ending. And so, but that also means finding people who help support those types of shifts and changes and transformations. So that could be friends, could be family members. I mean, my mother was an entrepreneur, so I think at some level, there was some innateness in me, but it also, like, I was surrounded around it as a younger person. So I think there was that kind of entrepreneurship that was probably I was exposed to, but had some propensity for. And I think the other thing that probably helped was I had a coach. I hired someone after I had my first coach, that kind of wakened me up, I guess you could say. But I think then I hired a coach to actually help hold me accountable. Right. Because it's hard to build habits that are not reinforced maybe by society. If it's, you need to provide, or you need to take care of others, or have certain things. And, so I think having someone kind of in your corner to help cheer you on, but also try and kind of kick you in the ass from time to time, I think that's important.
Yeah, I think for me, that's one thing I've learned along the way, is to ask for help more often and hire the right help at the right points in time to kind of help me get through some of those transitions. One thing I've also noticed from my own journey, and I continue to cultivate this as consciously as I can, is how do I surround myself with people who build me up, I want to say, or aligned enough with who I am and who I want to be. And I feel like they're a part of that upward spiral versus maybe something else. So part of that journey for me has been about, embracing new relationships, cultivating new relationships, and in some cases, letting go of old relationships. What's your journey been along that, as far as like finding the right people and cultivating more relationships with the right people and maybe letting go of some relationships along the way too?
Yeah. Well, I have a hard time letting go of things, so I'm not sure I'm probably the best one to provide any sage advice around letting go. But I do think the more mindfulness and the more I've embraced Buddhism as a practice and detachment kind of at a broader level, I think that's helped. But I agree with you. Your comment about, kind of like who you surround yourself with. I heard a podcast years ago that Tim Ferriss had presented, and it was, I don't remember who he was interviewing, but it was like you become like the person that you spend most time with. Like, I think there were like 5 people. The 5 people you spend the most time with in your life, you're most likely to become like.
Right.
And I was like, oh, like who are those 5 people that I spend the most time with? And you kind of like take stock of that and you go like, are they actually helping to support me to grow and develop and move closer to this thing that I want to be? Or are they holding me back from that? So I do think there is something around your network and those that are closest to you that, do you surround yourself with people who are going to, support the growth that you're looking for versus those that maybe are not in a growth mindset? I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've noticed is that if I'm not with people who also share a large growth mindset, then I don't grow as much. Right. Because I think they tend to like shrink that in me at some level. And so I tend to, I think, probably seek out people that are more risk takers, that are more non-traditional kind of entrepreneurs and people that are just really always working on their involvement.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in continuous learning, continuous growth. I think we're meant to grow and learn our entire lives. The model that we sort of get taught, and maybe in many ways get taught in the Western world, is like we're kind of finish high school or college and then you're sort of done and you go work the rest of your life, and you're learning at some pace, but it's not really embraced or focused on or cultivated as much. And to me, it's a form of death if we're letting go of that or not focused enough on our own growth. And I think we're all to varying degrees, like really inspired to grow and continue learning. And if many of us get stuck though along the way. And so one thing that I try to balance too is when I'm trying to cultivate the right relationships and deepen relationships with the right people and maybe let go of some relationships, is that someone who makes me feel uncomfortable can actually be a good thing, depending on the circumstances, depending on why I'm feeling uncomfortable. But if it's confronting me with some of my own triggers, some of my own edges, and it might feel very uncomfortable. And it's easy for me, and I think for many of us, to kind of confuse that discomfort with maybe this isn't the right person to spend time with. Maybe I need to, cultivate a relationship with someone else instead of this person. So I'm always trying to be mindful of like cultivating the relationships with the right people and not running away from relationships that are actually serving me in ways that maybe don't feel good, but it is serving me. What's your take on that, and how do you kind of navigate that territory?
Yeah, I'm smiling and shaking my head because that resonates with me. I think probably some of the people that I'm closest with today, those relationships started out in constructive discourse.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't, we didn't see eye to eye on something. We weren't aligned. We weren't, maybe our values were in conflict with each other at some level. I think that's absolutely true. But I think most people, like you said, kind of shy away from, this is uncomfortable, so it must be wrong. Right. Versus actually trying to, rather than resist it and move away, how do you get curious and actually move closer? And so I think, that's, again, probably some level of comfort with being uncomfortable. I think growth people or growth mindsets probably embrace that differently at some level. And I also think it really comes down to how well you know yourself and how well you don't know yourself. I think, when you have a relationship with others, whether it's an intimate partner, a friend, a family member, a coworker, a boss, and you're like, they're triggering me, right?
Right.
It's an opportunity to hold up the mirror and go, well, what is it about me that is being triggered? Right. And it's rarely about them. It's usually about us, but most of us don't have the consciousness to actually make that or notice that, I think, in the moment. And so then we tend to make it about them, right? They are stupid, they're slow, they're whatever. It's not about like, oh, I'm not being patient, I'm not being kind, I'm not being generous. I think it's almost always in here and not out there, but we tend to project it out there.
Right. Whatever's causing us discomfort or some emotions we don't like, whatever it might be, it points us to a trigger that we can look at and get better at and not be so reactive to, right? So it's a learning opportunity all the time. And at the same time, if we're surrounding ourselves with people who trigger us like all the time, it becomes exhausting, right? So it's a balancing act. But I try to be mindful of not running away from the trigger, but more consciously choosing who I want to spend more time with and who I don't, based upon them helping me on my path. And related to that, as I said before, one of my core beliefs is that we're all meant to continue growing and learning. And I'm definitely committed to that on my path. My business is committed to that. I surround myself with people who are largely committed to that. And in my work with clients, it varies between one and the next, of course. But in some cases, some are more open to that or more in that mindset than others. And whether it's a client or a friend or a colleague or just someone I've met somewhere along the road, I'm always asking myself, like, how do I influence them to embrace more of that growth mindset? So they might not be in the similar mindset that I'm in. They might be more in a fixed mindset. But how do I sort of invite them to become more of that growth mindset that I think we're all really meant to be at some level? What's your take on that? Do you find yourself like really consciously trying to help people in every conversation? Not for me, not necessarily every conversation, but I do try to focus on it and pull people towards that more growth mindset, because I believe that we're meant to be there more often than we are not meant to be there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's about just staying curious with them, right? I think we tend to ask questions. We try and not share the answers. We try and probably in the moment, in the micro moment, if you have someone that you're interacting with or you're close to, I think it's probably coaching skills that probably show up for us that have that kind of professional training. But I think it all comes down to just how can you stay curious, right, and stay out of judgment.
Right.
I think it's so easy to slip into judgment and stay out of curiosity. So you talking about like how we tend to resist and versus maybe stay with and get closer. I always come back to, and I think you and I've talked about this before, but Tara Brach's work around radical acceptance.
Yeah.
She uses that park bench as a metaphor of like, well, invite it in, have it sit down next to you. And I think like, if we can bring those people or those situations closer and actually, stay curious and stay in it, not only do we grow, but I think we have an opportunity to influence others that maybe aren't used to that kind of experience. So there's probably a little bit of micro mentorship there, but and then I think there's also some people that just, they won't tolerate it, right? They don't have any interest in like helping them be curious or be curious about them. I think, and that's where I think maybe what you were saying earlier that resonates with me. It's like, well, how do you also then recognize when it's not going to be a positive interaction or an affirming relationship, and how do you let that go without judgment as well?
Right. I think judgment is also pointing us to if not a trigger, at least a judgment of ourselves. I think when we judge others, we're actually judging ourselves. We're taking something that we drive ourselves by, a judgment if we become a certain way or we don't do a certain thing, whatever it is, and then we project that on the outside. So that curiosity combined with radical acceptance, I think, is a really powerful tool to invite people into conversation that doesn't feel threatening. It feels like it's an opening conversation versus a threatening conversation. Then people, I think, become more open in general as a result of that experience. Even if it's like a 10-minute conversation, then I don't see the person again for whatever reason, or it's a much longer relationship. In either case, it's an opportunity to, again, do my best to invite them into that.
Well, I think, if it may not have immediate influence, but I think it probably shows up somewhere, and they may or may not recognize that later too. But I do think, again, maybe that's just kind of like laws of attraction and the universe and how my head or my thinking goes around. Just, I don't know. Someone told me once, like, the quality of your relationships determines the quality of your life. And I firmly believe that. And I think that doesn't even mean like if the relationship is not strong, that it can improve the quality of my life, right? Because I believe there's a unity in difference. And so I may not agree with someone's position or their behaviors or their values, but that doesn't make them wrong. It gives me an opportunity to go, there's some unity in difference too. And so I think that's probably more of an evolved kind of position than you're bad and I'm right and you're wrong, and that kind of mentality that I think many of us can slip into.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to judge than it is to accept. Accepting people as they are, even though we might have opinions about what they're doing or not doing, but not judging them for it is a place that I try to lean into for sure. Like accept them as they are versus judging them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, we're kind of touching on this. I think a lot of this comes down to one thing I want to reflect on is that you said quality of life ultimately comes down to quality of relationships. And I think that's largely true, maybe entirely true. I would add to that I think the quality of our relationships with others starts from within. Like the quality of our relationship with ourselves actually cultivates much higher capacity for strong relationships with others. And so that's a place to start for sure. Is like, how do we relate to ourselves in the best possible way and support ourselves? And from there, we can have much stronger relationships.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. I think most people just don't know themselves very well, right? They want to, or they have a desire maybe to, but they don't always have the tools to figure out how to do that. So, and I think people don't always have the self-compassion either. Like, I think they don't really allow themselves to fail without judgment. They don't allow themselves to take risks because of fears. There's that whole kind of limiting beliefs that I think people tend to run around with, which is kind of where we started. But if we can't be compassionate, then I don't think that we are self-compassionate, then I don't think we can fully also have the joy and the bounty from, being able to release in ourselves of judgment and others.
Yeah, and that goes back also to the earlier part of our conversation where we talked about organizational improvement and transformation has to include the individual. Like that individual relationship to ourself is foundational to any organization being at their best too. Yeah. I'm curious. I know we need to wrap up. You've got to get to your next thing. What are you taking away from this conversation today?
What am I taking away from this conversation today? I think, for me, it's similar to probably a mindset that I've been thinking about as we kind of work through this pandemic and the opportunities that are going to come out of it. And to me, that there's something there around how do we choose curiosity over certainty. Yeah. And, I think it's easy and it's safe to try and take the certain route, or for some reason, certain is coming up in my head right now, but maybe it's safety. And we don't really kind of grow fast or grow big if we're kind of like moving along incrementally. And so what I'm taking from this conversation is, how can I also help leaders and our organizational clients think about, really kind of wiping the slate clean and having kind of like, this is an opportunity for a reset. What would you really like it to look like? And how can we help you do that? And so, and I'm also trying to think about that and apply that to myself and our businesses. I normally travel quite a bit for work, and my client meetings are not happening right now because we're not traveling. Planes are not going anywhere. So it's, kind of back to what I said earlier. We're trying to go, what's the work that I really want to be doing? How do we build something towards that? And how can I use this time to try and maybe accelerate that? So I think it's, somebody was talking about the pause recently. I don't know if you've been reading or hearing about this, but this is like the
great pause. Yeah.
Some people are going to do great things in it, and other people are just going to be like, they're not going to like really maybe figured out anything as they've kind of been sitting around or kind of working home or sheltered in home for, a couple of months. So, and that's human nature, but I would hope to be one of the people that's on the opposite end of that, where it's like, what can I create from this versus what has this caused in discomfort for me?
Yeah, and you touched on a lot of things there. One of them is, from my perspective, we're constantly evolving. And so it's easy to think of kind of finding your purpose or finding your meaning in life, or the combination of the two, as being a one-time deal. I don't look at it that way. It's a constant uncovering. It's a constant reassessing. It's a constant checking in with myself and my business, my life. Does it still align? Are my values shifting in some ways? Have I gotten out of alignment in other ways? And we do it in ebbs and flows. We're not doing that like literally all the time, but I think it's something we need to be revisiting on a regular basis, because it's easy for our values to shift in ways that we don't necessarily get consciousness about, or just allow our behaviors to kind of shift in ways that no longer align. And so the constant reassessment and the great pause that we're having right now is a great opportunity to do more of that and really think in a deep way, like who do we want to be organizationally, leadership-wise, on a personal level going forward. I really appreciate your time today. I know you've got to get to the next thing. So if people want to find you and learn more about you, how can they do that?
Go to our website, leadarc.design is one place to go. That's probably the primary place given the context of this conversation that would be. If you're interested in social sector work, I run an organization called Sword Soul Group. Our website there is swordsoul.org. So either of those two places would be places to try and find me.
Awesome. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good rest of your day.